Hey again, this is Russ, and welcome to this section on designing network solutions. In this section, we'll be talking about planning virtual networks. We'll discuss solutions for name resolution and some network addressing. We'll understand Azure-based name resolution. We'll talk about solutions for hybrid networks and implementation of a secure hybrid network, in this case, the perimeter network. This lesson is going to be about planning virtual networks. So when you're going to lay out a virtual network in Azure, there are a few things you need to keep in mind. First off, do you have any organizational security requirements for isolating traffic? Meaning, do you have, say, dedicated users on-prem or elsewhere that need application access and that traffic needs to be restricted so that only those users can actually access the app? That'd be a good example of why you would want to make these restrictions. How many network interfaces and private IP addresses are you going to need in your virtual network? And remember, you do have limits on how many NICs you can have in any given subscription. So if you're thinking you're going to have thousands of IP addresses, remember that you're not going to have network interfaces to match all of them. Do you have any organizational or administration requirements for having resources in different virtual networks? What that basically means is, do you need to separate your networks for different departments, for example? Do you want to have an isolated network for DevOps people, a different one for, say, business systems, and then a different one still for customer-facing services, things like that? And lastly, are you going to want to connect your virtual network to another virtual network or an on-prem network, which means you're going to need to be aware of the traffic between those virtual networks, or in the case of going to on-prem, you're going to need a gateway and possibly VPN, or maybe even ExpressRoute. So when you're looking at subnets, some Azure service resources, like VPN gateways, will actually require that you make a subnet expressly for them. Not every Azure service that uses networking is going to require this, but many do. So make sure that whenever you've laid out your network addressing, you've allowed for space for things like this. Azure routes traffic between all subnets in a virtual network. So if you've laid out several subnets in your network, then you're going to automatically have some communication between them. If you're going to be routing any traffic through a virtual appliance, then make sure and deploy your resources to different subnets. Network security groups, NSGs, can be assigned to subnets to control subnet traffic, so that automatic traffic that Azure allows can be locked down quite a bit. You can work it essentially like a firewall, restricting whatever ports and direction traffic is necessary. And additionally, using service endpoints on subnets to limit access to resources like databases or storage accounts. And there's a number of other service endpoints that you can configure for a subnet. By default, you have pretty much access to everything. So you'll want to be aware of what services your subnets are going to be accessing or what services they may host, and act accordingly. On that note, we're going to talk a little bit about security. So you're going to always want to filter your network traffic between resources using an NSG or a virtual appliance, firewall, or actually even both. They don't really conflict. You want to use virtual appliances to create perimeter networks when you have resources that are going to be accessed to the internet, but resources that need to be restricted from internet access as well. So you're familiar with DMZs, and that's NSGs and NVAs are the way you're going to create them. So if you run into a scenario in the exam that says you have an application with perhaps secure data in the background, and they want to know how you'll set that network up, remember that you're going to want to have a network appliance in place and create a DMZ between your resources and the net. You can also use application security groups. Now, these are traffic rules for VMs in the same subnet, which means in the same virtual network as well, and you apply them to network interfaces. So if you have a server in a subnet that talks to another server in a subnet, but you want them to, say, only talk to that server or to not communicate on certain ports, then you can, say, lock down, say, a SQL server from talking to another SQL server. So if one of the SQL boxes gets compromised, it won't automatically allow the other SQL boxes on that subnet to be compromised as well. As I mentioned earlier, NSGs allow all traffic to flow between all resources in a virtual network. So again, by default, you have open access between subnets in your virtual network. Lock them down. And lastly, here in security, you're going to want to change your default outbound traffic rules via a route table, which will force traffic to flow through that virtual appliance you've set up or the VPN gateway. You're going to want to do this to make sure that you don't have outbound traffic going just sort of out into the cloud in general. You always want to make sure that that traffic gets routed to where it's supposed to go, and running through a virtual appliance like a firewall, for example, will make sure that you don't get inadvertent traffic flow. All right, now talking about connectivity in your networking. So between your virtual networks, you're going to want some to talk to each other, and they can be in different subscriptions, even in different Active Directory tenants and different regions. And if you want them all to communicate properly, you're going to want to set up virtual network peering. It's pretty standard. It really is just like like setting up a VPN to a local network that's on-prem. And you want to set them up for virtual networks that need to be connected despite their region or subscription separations. It's important to note that the traffic that happens between peers on a virtual network always occurs over the Microsoft backbone. This traffic does not actually travel over public internet. For those on-premise connections, your virtual networks need to be set up through a VPN gateway or use ExpressRoute. Combining peering and a VPN gateway will allow you to create hub and spoke networks. A note on name resolution when dealing with peering. Azure DNS doesn't resolve network names in a peered network, so that hub and spoke that was just created is going to need some kind of DNS server or service behind it to make sure that you can get proper, fully qualified domain names and the like working for you. You can do this, of course, again, with a private DNS server or using Azure DNS private domains. So basic permission and policies for the virtual network you set up. This is going to be access to that network by administrative personnel or maybe application groups, that sort of thing, and you want to limit what each of those teams can do. So you're going to start with setting up your permissions and assign them to the scope in the following hierarchy. Now, this, of course, is the top rules going all the way down to the resource. So we're going to start with management groups, which you may be familiar with, then your permissions at the subscription, the resource group level, and then the resource itself. Of course, the most restrictive always applies. When working with virtual networks, the owner, contributor, and network contributor roles are probably the only ones you want to use. Generally speaking, you wouldn't want to give owner permissions out. It's very easy to destroy a lot of work if someone can alter networking, so be very careful about who you give those rights to. And you also want to use Azure Policy. This lets you set up rules on your resources to maintain whatever degree of security that you would like to have in place. You can pre-configure NSGs to restrict certain types of network traffic out of the gate. And policies get applied at the management group, subscription, and then the resource group. Now, strictly speaking, you can apply policy to a resource directly as well, but given that policies are generally put in place before resources are deployed, it's not really considered a best practice. And that'll do it for the basics of setting up or planning to deploy a virtual network. Come on over to the next video and we will continue. See you there.